When we look at disease as far as how it affects different people, there's a lot of things to consider. And so you can kind of see in the center here, these three circles merge into infection. And so in order for an infection to occur, there has to first be a susceptible host. So some people are more susceptible than others. If you kind of think to when maybe if you've ever been out to dinner with someone and you had the same exact food and then one of you got food poisoning but one of you did not, it may be that the one person is more susceptible. And so, or, maybe it had less of the actual microbe that was consumed or the toxin, but you can kind of think of that as an idea. The mode of transmission, that can be different. So sometimes the mode can be respiratory. So if the microbe likes to get into the host via the respiratory tract, maybe it's less likely to via the digestive tract instead. So if you ate it versus you inhaled it, there could be a very large difference there as well. Some microbes are so infectious that they have all kinds of modes of transmission. The source of the pathogen or the reservoir, what are you coming into contact with as well? And so where is this pathogen living? Is it in the soil? Is it in the water? Is it in a host that's getting passed on? But all of this has to come together in order to actually cause the infection, or they all play a role in the infection. As far as the course of disease, this can be broken down into kind of some common stages here. This is just kind of showing a flu, like influenza. And so the time period here is going to be different for all kinds of different diseases. First of all, there's usually an incubation period. So if the virus in this case found its way into the susceptible host, it's going to take a little bit of time to multiply. A few viruses are going to infect a few cells, and that's not going to be a problem. But it's when the viruses multiply inside those cells, and then they go on and infect a lot of other cells that they really spread and multiply. But that's usually going to take a few days. Some organisms have really long incubation periods, some organisms have really short incubation periods. So again, the timeline is specific to the flu here, but could be very different. Oftentimes, not always, there's what we call a prodromal phase, and this is usually where a person kind of starts to not feel right, but isn't really incredibly sick. This doesn't always happen. But it just might be if you've ever kind of thought, oh, I just don't feel right. Sometimes kind of felt like, oh, I feel a cold coming on, and then a couple days later, then you're really sick. That feeling really sick would be the acute period. And so in this case with the flu, fever, chills, aches, tiredness, you probably would be in bed for these kinds as well. If you think of the virus itself, that virus is at its peak, and so it has the maximum amount, and it's causing a lot of damage throughout the body. After a while, hopefully, when your immune system starts to take care of the virus, there will be a period of decline. So that person generally starts to feel better, maybe not great, but the microbes are literally declining in numbers as well. And so a lot of times then there's a period of convalescence. So the symptoms usually fade, and the virus usually gets eliminated from the body. But there may be a time period where the body is kind of in a weakened state. And so I always kind of tell my students, if you're sick, you want to be careful that you don't do too much at the end of that illness, because sometimes people want to get right back to work, right back to school, but you have to kind of take it easy so that you don't relapse or you don't pick up something else in kind of that weakened state. Now, missing class during a period of convalescence, I don't always agree with. Just kidding. So as far as disease goes, if we think about it from a pathogen standpoint, the pathogen has to overcome the body's immune system. And so if you are a microbe and you're going to cause disease, you have to do a few things first. The first one is this microbe has to gain entry. This is often commonly called the portal of entry. There's different ways to get into the body. It could be respiratory, through the nose or the mouth, but getting into the lungs, into the airways. Gastrointestinal, also called the fecal-oral route. So if somebody is eating something or taking something in that goes through their stomach. Genitourinary could be sexual contact, could just be, microbes getting into the urinary system without sexual contact. And then an opening in the skin or getting through the skin. The skin is usually a pretty good barrier for these things not to get through, but sometimes it does happen. So first of all, they have to gain entry. Once they gain entry, they have to find a way to attach and get into cells. And so tissues are groups of cells, You know, attaching to one cell is not going to be a big deal, but when it attaches to several cells that are of that same type, then we would talk about tissues. So it has to attach, and then it has to gain entry into those specific cells. Once it does that, the body will probably, the body will stimulate an immune reaction to start, and then it just kind of depends on who wins as well. And so if they overcome the host's immune system, at least temporarily, then they cause the damage and that person gets sick. Hopefully after that, the immune system catches up and is able to eliminate the pathogen. But the pathogen wants to also then go on and infect something else. And so we would call this the portal of exit. So any way that that pathogen can get out would be an example. So if it's through the respiratory route, a cough or a sneeze. If it's through the GI route, then maybe through feces. It could be, blood. It could be a mosquito bites and picks it up from the blood. It could be through sexual contact. But this is kind of thinking about it from the microbes point of view. There are also some other factors that come into play, and we can look at this. This is where there's numbers out for those that have been studied, but we would call this the infectious dose. And so there's actually numbers out there that's called the ID50, the infectious dose for about 50% of the population. And so that just means how much does it take to actually cause disease. If I, am exposed to one little bacteria in my food, is that going to cause me food poisoning? Well, probably not. But how many bacteria would I have to be exposed to for them to be able to take over and cause disease? Invasiveness means how much damage do they actually do. So some diseases aren't as invasive as others, but certainly some that maybe you'll look at in the future are very invasive. Maybe we'll look at the flesh-eating bacteria, and those do a lot of damage, and a lot of times irreversible damage in that case. So this figure here just kind of illustrates that there has to be a certain dose in the first place that gets past the host defensive barriers. They have to get into the host tissues and then damage that tissue as well, and then leave and pass on to something else most likely. One thing that bacteria do, you can get sick from a bacterial infection when the numbers of bacteria increase, but another thing a lot of bacteria can do is they can secrete toxins. And so this is what comes out of their cell or comes from around their cell, and these toxins are what a lot of times cause a lot of damage and allow the bacteria to overcome the host tissues as well. And so these are classified as exotoxins and endotoxins. Exotoxins a lot of times come from gram-positive bacteria, but the idea is that they come from the inside of the bacteria and they are secreted. So the bacterial cell itself stays intact. And so some examples here, Clostridium botulinum causes a nervous system disorder, botulism. Clostridium tetani causes tetanus. Hopefully you've been vaccinated, had your tetanus shot in order to prevent that as well. A lot of Staphylococcus bacteria and Streptococcus bacteria produce a lot of different toxins, several of them, and they can cause all kinds of nasty side effects. So antitoxins can prevent damage. Usually these are the cases of vaccines. If you were to receive your tetanus vaccine, that would mean that you're given a little bit of that antitoxin, and then if you come into contact with the exotoxin from Clostridium tetani, your body could fight it off. Endotoxins actually come from the cell wall of the gram-negative bacteria themselves. A lot of these cause intestinal diseases from Salmonella, Shigella, things like that. And so it's just something that the bacteria has acquired in order to be effective, in order to invade that host. So now we'll be looking very briefly at immunity. This does get pretty complicated. We are not going into much detail as your book, so just pay attention to what the study guide kind of tells you, but I just want you to have an overall general idea. And if you're interested, you certainly can read more about it. So we can look at immunity as being nonspecific or specific. In the case of nonspecific, we say that this is naturally born or innate. And so this is when our body either has these barriers or acts against an invader, but it's kind of generic. It's a fast response, but we don't know exactly what it is that we're reacting against. And so we would break this down into our first line of defense and then also our second line of defense. There are mechanical barriers and chemical barriers, and these act together in order to prevent most things from even getting into our body in the first place. So one example of a mechanical barrier is skin. And so your skin cells are really tightly packed together, and they're pretty dry, and therefore microorganisms have a hard time kind of getting into your body between those cells. You kind of have to go through those cells, and since it's so dry, it doesn't really support a lot of life being sustained there as well. The inside of the body is kind of similar. It's not as dry, it has a mucous membrane, but it has these thick, tightly packed cell layers as well. And then the other cases here, like saliva, tears, and urination, just the physical act of that fluid is going to ward off some microorganisms. Chemical, there's different chemicals. Lysozyme is a chemical that's found in tears and different secretions in the body. The pH in the vagina is usually very acidic, so that most intruders can't live and can't multiply and find their way. This is to protect the uterus in order so that it becomes, a sterile place to be, and that only, the proper cells get to it when they need to. Interferon is a substance. There's different types, but in general, it disrupts viruses from multiplying. So an initial virus may get into a host cell, but then it's less likely to spread if interferon acts. So the second line of defense, again, this is innate, so this is kind of what you're born with and what you just these general events, one of which is phagocytosis, and this is shown here in this diagram. And so phagocytosis, certain blood cells, there's a few different types that actually are able to do this, but they surround something and take it in and digest it. And so they change their shape, like they're seeing that digest this bacteria here. And so here's the bacteria, the cell actually takes it into itself, and then using different enzymes breaks it down and then basically spits it out. And so that's called phagocytosis. Inflammation, and so this increases blood flow. The blood vessels become more permeable, and so there are certain white blood cells and chemicals that are circulating throughout the body, and they may need to get to the tissues where there could be infection. So inflammation helps this to occur more quickly. Fever, increasing body temperature, also increases metabolism, and so different substances that need to be made and transported can be made more quickly. So a little bit of a fever is a good thing. It's just when the fever gets too high that can be dangerous because it can be damaging to the body itself. There are other responses out there. There's something called complement. These are different proteins that cause different reactions to happen. They can cause inflammation, they can cause phagocytosis. And so a lot of these kind of work together as well. But I just want you to kind of know in general that these are the second line of defense, and these are innate or naturally born. So specific defense is acquired. A lot of different ways to a lot of different terminology you'll see, so I try to put up here as many as I can. But basically, sometimes it's called the third line of defense. And so if the first and the second have failed, then the third may have to take hold. And so this time you're looking at what specifically you've come into contact with. And your cells identify this as an antigen. And so an antigen is kind of a tag on the pathogen. It's not necessarily the whole molecule, but just a little bit. And so the body recognizes that it's something that's not supposed to be there, and it can learn what exactly it is and how to mount a better response. This is going to take a little longer in the first place, but this also has memory. So if your body comes into contact with an antigen for the first time, it'll mount a response, take a little bit of time, but the next time it sees it, it's going to be much faster because it's already going to have some of these cells ready to go and can make more cells to do this very quickly. And so B cells and T cells are blood cells that are called lymphocytes. There are other types of lymphocytes, but these are the ones that are involved with this specific or acquired immunity in the third line of defense. So the two major responses, it depends kind of on what the pathogen is and where it is, whether it's inside a cell or outside of the cell. Again, we're not going to go into a lot of detail here, but basically they're cell mediated. This involves a lot of different types of T cells, and these T cells secrete chemicals that can attack the antigen. And so basically, we need to destroy the antigen because that's what is on the pathogen. That's part of the pathogen. The other type is antibody mediated, and so this mostly involves B cells. We can sometimes see a T helper cell in this case. But basically the B cells make antibodies, and the antibodies then attack the antigen, and then something happens from there in order to destroy the antigen there as well. And there's different types of antibodies. Again, they're mentioned in your textbook if you want to read into more detail about those. We can also classify specific immunity, and we can say that it's either active or passive. And active means that the response is directly to the antigens itself. If it's passive, then we're looking at the antibody, and there's a response to the antibody. Both are definitely take place. When we look at natural versus artificial, natural is just like it sounds. It happens without, much intervention. But artificial usually acquires some sort of vaccination, some sort of shot, that you may go somewhere to get. Or could be, you can see in the case of passive artificial, it could be some sort of shot, but also could be an IV transfer of antibodies here as well. But active means antigens, passive refers to antibodies, and then we have natural and artificial for both. So there's actually sort of 4 different types, and you should just be familiar with the different types that you see.